Greetings and salutation, dear viewer, and welcome to the podcast for the politics of discretion. Now, I have to warn you, I am in a bit of a mood this week because there's a lot of semantical nonsense going on in Washington and vagaries in language, particularly when they touch on sweeping national legislative efforts that affect you and me, really don't make me very happy. And what I mean by this is the calling on things like the national interest or the public good or the people as an ultimate catch-all justification for some sort of sweeping public policy. The idea being that because we live in a democratic nation, at least nominally democratic, America is not actually a democracy, yet another semantical point that drives me up the wall. But because we have democratic processes in these countries, and because, as is written in the Declaration of Independence, the will of the people is really the sole legitimate font of political power in the nation, Americans really suffer the particular form of government at their own pleasure, and if they feel that government has abandoned whatever that will might be, then they do have some sort of legitimacy to change the modus operandi of government. But because we have this sentiment in our country and really in the very fabric of our country, there's this idea that the people are imbued with some sort of morality that cannot be challenged, cannot be assailed, cannot be touched. And this essentially means that a lot of political initiatives are undertaken in the name of the people, and that means that anyone who stands against that is against the people and is against the nation and is against the national interests and all that sorts of thing. And that to me is troubling for a number of reasons. First of all, who are the people? This is not a simple question. And if you ask someone, what is the public good, then, usually they don't have an answer. And the follow-on question to that is, who gets to define the public good? And this gets to yet another semantical issue, there's a theme here, in politics, and this is a little pedantic, so bear with me. The idea of collective versus singular nouns in our politics. So, Congress, like America, is meant to reflect a multiplicity of interests. This is the real genius of the Founding Fathers, is there are all, obviously we know the system of checks and balances through the co-equal branch of powers, co-equal branches and the separation of powers. We know all of that really basic fundamental stuff about how government operates, but there are other designs to the system that are meant to reflect the nature of humanity, and this idea that self-interest, when properly applied, is a check upon the self and upon tyranny. And by that I mean, if I live in some small little village and I need meat to survive, right? This is a small village, there's not a big grocery store around, and I'm not a farmer. So I rely on my neighbor down the road, who is a cattle rancher, to provide me with the beef that helps me to survive from day to day. I'm probably not going to try to drive him out of town. I'm probably not going to anger him. I'm probably going to be rather pleasant to him and deal nicely with him because he provides me a service that I want, right? This is this idea of a community of interest, and that because there is something in common, and it works both ways, by the way. That farmer, because I'm providing him with a livelihood, I'm providing him with the money, which allows him to run his business and to buy whatever other goods he wants, is probably going to treat me with a basic level of respect. So there's that reciprocality to it in that community of risk, or community of interest. Community of risk is pretty much the same thing. It's actually a term from a James Fenimore Cooper novel, but that's another question. So these communities of interest help to create this really complex and intricate web based on needs, based on desires, and it helps create checks and balances upon society so that you don't just have total anarchy, total upheaval, but you have people who order themselves and order their needs and order their interactions with others based on what serves their self-interest and helps them to survive, and more than that, to thrive from day to day. So this is something that occurs naturally. And the idea of much of Congress and the idea of majority and minority factions and the multiplicity of interests is that this little ecosystem is reflected in Congress so that you have different factions with different viewpoints and ideas and interests and hierarchies of values and all those sorts of things which make people individuals, that is then reflected into the legislative process. And because you have all these competing needs and we're supposed to then argue it out over what ought to be pursued, because government obviously can't do everything and it has extremely limited powers, so it's not meant to do a whole lot to begin with. But this is yet another check on the system. It prevents things from being railroaded through Congress without any sort of debate, without any sort of consideration as to what its long-term effects might be, because different interest groups are then going to say, wait, stop, if you do X, then it's going to affect my livelihood, and that's going to mean that in the long run, my life is going to deteriorate and I'm not going to be able to pay taxes, which is going to cause, the entire government to maybe change, things like that. But what this requires is a recognition that the polity or the people or the nation as a whole is not a singular entity. And this is the problem with the lexicon of modern politics, is when we speak of the people, we speak of it not as merely a catch-all term for the collective individuals who make up the citizenry as a whole. It doesn't reflect the individuality and ultimately the agency and the sovereignty that each individual retains, even though they live under the influence of the federal government. When we speak of the people, it's no longer a collective noun in that sense. It's become a singular noun. It is one person with one agenda. It's got one will. It's one interest. There's no degree of attention paid at all to the idea that there are multiple constituencies in the polity with multiple interests, with multiple backgrounds and diverse needs, and that these need to be paid attention to when policy is being crafted so that ultimately no one's rights are being violated and tyranny is not happening, that the public good is actually being pursued. If we want to define the public good, and I don't want to because I don't like this idea of the public as an entity that exists beyond the idea that I might join a particular interest group in my private life because I share one commonality, right? Maybe I join a painting group because I want to paint, or I go to some sort of political rally because I'm interested in that issue. That is a point of unison only in that singular area. It does not mean that those people who are at either the painting group or at the political rally, I might fundamentally disagree with them on other things in life and have nothing to do with them outside of that one point of unity. So this idea that there is society or community which ultimately binds everyone together as one and in only one way, I just think is really pernicious and really damaging to the idea of self-sovereignty and individual ability to pursue good. So I don't really want to define the public good or talk about commonalities in that way. But if we are going to talk about it, and we do need to in reference to government, because government requires action. Politics, by its definition, are things that are not personal. They involve the interests of more than one person. So we do have to talk about commonalities, if even in a very limited sense. So if you want to define the public good, I think we need to define it in a manner that recognizes that there are these points of commonality, and this is where public policy needs to come up with solutions, but it needs to do so in a manner that understands, reflects, and respects these differences between people, right? The points where there are not commonalities, where people retain their individuality, excuse me. And this can only be done by paying heed to this idea of multiplicity of interest. This is why policy should be very narrowly tailored. So it addresses a specific issue where there is a community of interest. And it's so narrow that it addresses that problem, but doesn't touch on other points where there are differences of opinion. Right? Obviously, this is not the process by which we craft public policy. It's sweeping, it's nebulous, and it calls upon the public good or the people as this ultimate justification. And this is where I get really grumpy and unhappy when we talk about the people or the public good, because this is meant to be this ultimate justification, right? To call upon the people is a touchstone for a sort of omnipotent will and morality that cannot be questioned. And when politicians invoke the public good in pursuance of their partisan agenda, not their political agenda, politics and partisanship are different. Here's yet another semantic point. But when they invoke that in the name of their particular partisan goals, what they're doing is asserting themselves into that idea that they are reflective of the people's will, and therefore they cannot be touched. And anyone who then stands against them is against the people, is against this sort of untouchable, unchallengeable morality, and should be viewed with suspicion, and is sort of antisocial, against the nation, right? There's this sense of almost, I don't want to say treason, particularly with the president's comments recently, but this almost treasonous attitude to it, where you're not only not with the public good, but you're against it by dissenting to it in any sort of way. And this contributes to this sort of hyper partisan back and forth, right? Where if you're a Republican and someone's a Democrat, or vice versa, you don't get along unless, of course, it's to make fun of the libertarian down the road, because no one likes libertarians anyway. But right, so that leads to that kind of tribalistic attitude, which is interesting when we talk about, the people or the national interest, and the idea that it's become this collective entity that's become a singular being, right? One will. And then we divide that down into tribalism, which doesn't necessarily go along with the idea of the singularity of politics and of the people as one body. But that kind of incongruence isn't really addressed, but yet it's there, and it causes issues, thus further leading to breakdowns in the political process, because again, we've rooted everything in partisanship. And the and politics has really become not the process of governing, but the vying of rhetorical strategies to see who can most effectively align their partisan goals with the interest of the people, who can best define that in a way that makes them synonymous and thus unable to be challenged. And beyond that, really, is this idea that I don't want to harp on too much, but I also do, because I think it's really important and really pernicious, and I don't think enough attention is paid to it. But this idea that the people is the ultimate catch-all justification, and that somehow makes government omnipotent, in the sense that it then has authority to do practically anything because it's doing it in the name of the people, so its motives are good. And this just means that it has unchallenged sweeping authority to intrude into individuals' lives wherever they happen to exist. And this, I think, might be a contributory factor to the idea that we have now, the people as this singular noun, which cannot be challenged, is that argument is supported by the fact that government has so many powers and vice versa. So it's like a self-perpetuating cycle. And well, I think one of the areas where we can see this working most clearly today is this idea of paid family leave. And the Republican proposal that's come out from Marco Rubio and from Ivanka Trump, it takes Social Security and allows family member or parents, presumably, although I don't know if, a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle could do something similar, probably not a grandparent because they'd be older, presumably, but allows them to chip into their Social Security fund and use some of that money to essentially use paid leave, so to provide for childcare. Now, and I believe the proposal is that that would then push up their age of retirement. And this is not the most terrible idea for paid family leave if we must have it. I don't like the concept because it undermines the idea that a job is a contract between a employer and an employee, which is entered into volitionally both by the company and the employee and is based on a mutual exchange of values, right? The employer gets whatever, job the employee is doing, is providing some service that ultimately helps him run his business, and in return the employee gets fair compensation. And this is the extent of the employee-employer relationship. This idea that employers are then responsible somehow for the employee's standard of living, I think is utterly ridiculous. Unless, of course, that employer wants that to be the case. And this is how the free market works, where if you as a potential employee value things like paid family leave, you should seek out an employer that also values that and is willing to provide for that. And that, again, is the basis of this volitional value for value exchange, which is the contract that is employment. Whether or not government has the ability to then compel the employer to step in and say you're responsible for the quality of your employees' lives, and you have to do things like provide for paid family leave, and not only when you can make a more, if you want to talk about maternal leave right after the birth of a child, maybe you have a little more point. Again, I don't think it's valid, particularly when government steps in. But you might have a little more solid of a case simply for medical reasons. But some plans go as far as to talk about things like parents getting home so that they can participate in their child's extracurricular activities. Look, you as an individual are responsible for your life, and that means that if you decide to have a family, that it's your responsibility to balance it. It is not your employer's responsibility, again, unless they want it to be, and that's their choice, and then that's up to you as an employee to find someone who shares that value, right? Again, this emphasis on value and shared values, and value being at the core of everything that you as an individual do. That ultimately, we here at the Politics of Discretion believe should be the basis of life, and we believe that that contributes to a much higher form of being, a more cohesive sense of self, which is necessary to one being the best that one can be. That being said, that exists completely separately from the sphere of government intrusion. This occurs in privacy, and one needs that privacy if one is to have the ability to choose one set of values. This gets to the pursuance of happiness. It's not just that you're free to pursue whatever ends that you want, but you get to define them for yourself. And again, we believe that this should all be rooted in value. But you cannot do that if you have an all-powerful government, which is coming in and doing things like telling employers that they need to provide for family leave. And yes, the Republican plan, which allows people to take Social Security, and use that for maternity leave or family leave or whatever, appears to be a little more privatized and respectful of the privacy of the employer relationship, but it's actually not, right? Because if you're doing that, presumably there are going to be accompanying laws that say that anyone who is taking time off and using this program cannot be fired by their employer. And probably your employer shouldn't fire you if you have a baby. But if you're going to be out for months at a time, then now you're affecting the employer's ability to run their business as they see fit. And you don't have a right to that which touches upon the lives of others or the services of others. So in that case, if the government is then stepping in and saying you must reserve this job for this person so that when they've used up this benefit, they can walk right back into their job, that might affect the employer's ability to do their business. So now you're infringing upon their rights and their ability to pursue whatever values they see fit, which to me is an extension of the right of conscience. And so it's problematic for that reason. So government really is actually intruding upon the private sphere of business, and even more of that is sort of negating the ability to pursue happiness, to pursue value, to pursue conscience. And this gets to the idea of the public good, right? We're pushing this policy of paid family leave because it feels good, because it feels humane, it feels compassionate. And the justification is, well, we're one of the few industrialized nations in the world that doesn't have it, which is not really an argument at all, is it? But if you challenge it, again, this gets to this idea of, well, suddenly you're not compassionate, suddenly you're not in the interest of the people, and you're pretty much automatically dismissed, and you can't even have an argument on the merits because now you've staked out a position that's against the common good or is against the public, and that is automatically disqualifying. And that really is the grit of the problem. Seems like a silly semantics issue, but when you get down into the details, which we never do in politics anymore, and again, I think that's deeply damaging, not just to the political process and to the ability to achieve efficacy, but also to the ability of individuals to actually hold, and not just hold, but to exercise rights. So self-sovereignty is really hollowed out, and that really, I think, is the chief goal of government, is to protect self-sovereignty. And so that is the extent of that rant for the day. Otherwise, as to what's going on the website this week, we've got the podcast, we've got the column. There'll be another column coming out for me tomorrow. We have more in Edifictions. Please check that out if you're interested. Otherwise, please engage with us on social media. We are the Politics of Discretion on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We would love to get more audience interaction, love to hear your feedback, love to foster debate on these issues, actual, real, substantive debate. Look, if we can't have this debate within the framework of politics, let's have it in the private sphere. Let's engage value to value as individuals and have these discussions, and hopefully that will trickle up into politics and into the legislative process. So again, thanks so much for watching. Thank you so much for supporting our content, and we hope to hear more from you soon. Until then, happy musing, dear viewers.